Welcome back to my weekend series. I am joined once more by our Walton director, Ralph Sinansky.
My first big star that I directed in 1960. And to finish the story I was telling you about Adrian before, in 1959 in New York, Equity had Equity Library Theater. And it was put together by actors in the union in Equity, and it was for a showcase. The actors were going to work without pay, but it was to showcase themselves, and it was very successful. So that there was a small group of actors on the West Coast that wanted to do an Equity Library Theater on the West Coast, where they would have members of Equity doing a play to showcase. And Adrian Martin and Wendell Holmes, to whom she was married at the time. And I knew of Adrian because she was in a production at the Players Ring, the production that followed the one that I did there. So hadn't really met her, but I knew of her. But Wendell I cast in a production at Gilmore Brown's Playbox of Bell Book and Candle. And Wendell was very involved in the union and in this project to bring it out. So Adrian and Wendell said, pick a play. So by this point, I directed, I think, a dozen plays. And I still wasn't launched. I thought I would go to Hollywood and, direct a couple of plays and be launched and have a career. So this was, a dozen plays later. I was working at CBS in production, but my directing was outside. And so I needed to do something that would get attention. I had already done a production of Death of a Salesman. I had done a great production of The Iceman Cometh, plus, 10 others, dramas, comedies. And so I picked An Old War Horse, Chicago by Maureen Watkins, and submitted it. And the board accepted it. And I was excited. And a couple of days later, they called and said, we can't get the rights. Maureen Watkins, the play had been written, I think, in probably 1923. And she had written it as a drama, but when it went on Broadway and became a hit, and then it actually was made into a movie, but it was a comedy. And she so resented the fact that they had turned her drama into a comedy that she refused to allow any production of Chicago until first. It wasn't allowed to be produced until after her death, when Bob Fosse took it and turned it into the musical Chicago. But Adrian said, pick another play. I said, why? And she said she was going to be let off the hook that easily. She said, I think you should do a production of Paul Osborne's Mornings at 7. And my response was, oh, that old wishy-washy thing. I don't want to do that. Well, she was relentless. She just kept at me, and I don't want to do it. She kept at me. I said, okay, I'll do it. So I submitted it. And a couple of days later, the board called or notified me. Wendell was on the board, and he knew I wasn't gung-ho enthusiastic. And so they had picked The Ladies of the Corridor, that John Erman, know the name? Good director. And I knew John, we were friends. They had picked his play. Now I have time to think. How wise was that? Well, you don't look back. A couple of days later, they called again. They couldn't get the rights to Ladies of the Corridor, where I do Mornings at 7. And I did it. We did it in a small theater in one of the parks in Beverly Hills. proscenium stage, 22 feet wide, $50 budget, nine actors. I mean, I got a review from James Powers in the Hollywood Reporter that was a Valentine. It just, that's all he talked about was the direction.
Sure.
And I was still on staff at Playhouse 90. And my job there, one of my jobs, there would be a person budget. And then as the play was in rehearsal and as it was gathering steam, and as they needed other things, if they needed something that was not included in the first budget, a request would come to me, and then I would take a slip into one of the executives, one of the CBS executives, Norman Felton, to get this new request approved. Well, the day that the reviews for Mornings at 7 came out, I had a request. So I took it into Mr. Felton, who was sitting reading the Hollywood Reporter. When I brought it in, he said, "Is this you?" I said, "Yes." And we talked. Well, I'll just make a long story short. I mean, that happened twice more when I did the next two plays. He never came to see the plays, but he always read the reviews and responded. And the following year, in 1961, he left his job as a CBS executive and went to Metro as a producer of his own production company, Arena Productions, and they were going to be bringing the old Lou Ayres film, Dr. Kildare, as a television series. And he took me with him as an assistant to the producer. And as a matter of fact, he told me that there was no job in the cable of organization for that. He created the job. I mean, the salary wasn't any bigger than the one I was getting at CBS, and that's a whole story. But I went there, and that was the beginning. I mean, 6 months later, I did get to direct my first one, and went on from there. And it was all because Adrian wouldn't let me say no.
That is so great.
Yes. Yeah. I love to tell that. I mean, yeah.
The ways we apparently fall into things.
Yes. Yes.
Those moments those connections that just create a path forward that otherwise wouldn't have happened.
My whole career is based on those. I mean, as a kid in freshman years in Iowa, in the middle of the country, I mean, I loved movies. I didn't see a professional stage play until I was 17 years old on a trip to the East Coast. I mean, I knew nothing about theater.
What direction did you think you were going to go?
I had no direction. I was a music major. I started taking piano lessons when I was 7 years old, and I was kind of going along that. And I was pretty good, but I know that I would never have been a concert pianist. I was good as a piano player, but I was not a musician. Didn't have the ear, didn't have that. And that was kind of, it just went along. Okay, I'll take the rest of the story. When I was a junior in high school, 17 years old, the high school, they didn't grade by letters, they graded by numbers. And the highest grade you could get was a 99. And I liked 99s. And my junior year, I was the editor of the school page in a local newspaper, Mason City Globe Gazette, came out a page every Saturday. I was the editor of that. But the supervisor of that page was an English teacher, Elizabeth Graves, towering woman. I mean, and she was fine, but she somehow found out that I had stayed out of school one day to go with my mother to a matinee of Gone with the Wind. And she only gave me a 95 instead of a 99. Well, that was goodbye, Miss Graves. So the next year when I was 17, and without the newspaper, when they did the school play, I thought, well, I'll try out, I'll get involved in that. So I auditioned for it. Yeah, it's all the kids did. So I didn't get cast, but I wanted to be in it. So somehow or other, and I don't know how I did this, but I became the assistant to Myrtle Ullman. She directed all of the school plays. And so I sat next to her. She would sit, her eyes would never leave the stage. And whatever the student was doing wrong, she would tell me what it was. And I had this big legal pad, and would sit by her, write them down. And afterwards, we'd go up on the stage. She'd put the actors in a ring around her. I would sit there and she would have me read them back. And she would then illustrate, describe, what it was. She was just quite great. So that at the end of that year, the next year, I was a freshman in the junior college right there. And I was enamored of this whole thing, theater. So I made arrangements and I was going to be her assistant on all the productions for part of my tuition. And that's what I did. And for me, it was I didn't know why she was doing what she was doing, but it was like a template. I mean, the detail. And at the end of that year, in fact, before the end of the year, she left before the final play and somebody else came in. And then at the end of that year, by then, war had been declared Pearl Harbor. And so I went for my sophomore year to Cedar Rapids to Coe College as a music major because they had an ROTC program, Reserve Officer Training Program. And so I went into that and I was there for 6 months. And then at the end of 6 months, our group was called up.
Something that I wanted to ask you as a director working with actors, do you feel that there were things that you learned from the actors?
Oh,
what do you feel were some of those things that made you, did you feel they made you a better director or just things that you learned?
well, I mean, part of it was working in community theater. I really had to direct. The acting training at the Playhouse was not that great. I mean, they had a staff of actors, and your first year there were projects, your Greek period, your Roman period, your whatever, and you would have a different acting teacher. And one, Dwight Thomas, his whole thing was, and this was for stage, not for film. They didn't have film schools yet. The year after I left, they finally put a camera in at the Playhouse, and they were going to have a television film course. But up until then, they weren't there. But Dwight Thomas, so he was teaching on stage. If you're going to walk, you always start with your right stage foot.
Mm.
And just all of those, and those are what I used that was the basic. And then the other thing, and this at this point was all instinctive. Gilmer Brown said he would tell his cast, "I don't believe you." And it was to be real. So the combination of reality and, which foot do you start in? How do you sit down in a chair? What do you do when you rise? I mean, it's just all of this. And that was the basis of my directing for the 4 years in community theater. And I did, I don't know, close to 20, I guess, 20 productions, all the way from Arsenic and Old Lace to The Strike.
Do you find there's a wide spectrum of how you have to work with each actor because of what speaks to them or what it takes when you need to really direct somebody? How different do you feel you need to approach different actors?
I've said this because I've been asked that question before, and I don't set what I'm thinking. That's there, but that's not what I presented then. I start with them. And I started this in community theater. And one other thing I found out, working with unprofessional actors, if you want to criticize them, don't tell them what's wrong. Tell them what's right about what they're doing and try to find a way to reason with them, to give them a reason to work from that as the basis so that it's them doing it and not them doing what you're telling them to do. When I came out to Hollywood, and there I found out I could pull back, and I didn't need, in fact, shouldn't direct as totally as I had, because I didn't need to. I mean, I can remember one time directing Richard Long and giving him a direction. He just looked at me like, really want me to do that? I pulled back and got to the place where I just couldn't do that anymore. And one of my favorite moments, I was directing, this was 1966, so I'd been at it for 5 years maybe. And I was directing an episode of the FBI, and with William Wyndham, wonderful actor.
Mm-hmm.
I think
and sweet man.
Yeah. Oh, yes. And you should look it up. The episode is The Assassin. He's dynamite. He's dynamite. And he only worked a couple of days. We had one day on location with two scenes, and the rest of his role took place in a hotel, in a hotel room. I remember he was on the bed. I was at the foot of the bed, and he did a scene, and I was always careful. At that time, I was always careful, probably a little verbose, to not tell them how to do it, but just to talk to them in terms of talking about the character and the involvement. And Bill said to me, I went through my speech, whatever, and Bill said, "Oh, you mean you want me to talk slower?" And I said, "No, I just want you to be more like Alan Ladd in This Gun for Hire." And he never said it again. He did 2 more shows after that. Wonderful relationship. He did that. He was in the one episode of Mission Impossible I did work. He's just great. And that was to show that won them the Emmy first year's the best series, The Train. And then later he was in a production of Hollywood Television Playhouse when I did it was a recorded tape production of Winesburg, Ohio. A wonderful actor.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining me for this segment. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.